Deborah Tuerkheimer is a professor at Northwestern University School of Law. She completed her studies at Harvard College and Yale Law School. Tuerkheimer served for 5 years as an assistant district attorney in New York County District Attorney's Office, where she specialized in domestic violence and child abuse prosecution. Laurie Levinson is a professor of law in ethical advocacy at Loyola Law School. She's also the founder of Loyola's Project for the Innocent. Professor Levinson teaches criminal law, criminal procedure, ethics, trial advocacy, and evidence, and has authored numerous books and articles on criminal law. So without any further ado, Professor Levinson.
Thank you, Rhoda. I am so honored and proud to be here to talk about this incredible book with its author, Deborah Tuerkheimer. And all of you should know how respected she is throughout the nation. So it's a thrill for me. And I just want to ask you the first question to get it started. What led you to write this book? It's a critically important topic, but how did you get started on writing this book?
Well, thank you. And before I answer that question, I want to say I'm thrilled and honored to be here. Thank you, AJU, and thank you, Laurie Levinson, whose work I have admired for so many years, and it really is a joy and an honor to be in conversation. I appreciate it. I started my career as a prosecutor, handling what we would now think of as special victims cases. And of course, credibility is central in those cases. And so from the very beginning of my career, credibility has been on my mind. When I became a law professor, I really focused on writing about the system's response to crimes against vulnerable populations. And gender violence in particular was my focus. It has been my focus ever since I joined the academy. And so I wrote a lot about law reform, and yet lurking underneath each of those articles was the question of credibility. I really never got away from thinking about credibility, because all the law reform in the world isn't going to make a difference if the people enforcing those laws and applying those laws are part of a culture that downgrades the credibility of accusers. When the Me Too movement exploded in 2017 in the fall with this blockbuster reporting on Harvey Weinstein, stories of sexual harassment, sexual abuse, sexual assault circulated and spread like wildfire. And yet still, it didn't seem to me that most of us knew how to respond to those stories. And certainly it didn't seem to me that our systems were responding well to these stories. And that's what prompted the book.
It's an amazing book because it really hits at the heart of what I see as the problems in our criminal justice area. But as you point out, this goes back to biblical times, right? And it's also phrased as he said, she said. What is the basic credibility problem that we do have, whatever the case? How is it that the woman's credibility is called into question?
Yes, this has been around since forever. In fact, we have a false accusation in the Bible. A woman who was scorned by Joseph then accuses him of rape. And so we know that this is an age-old problem. This notion that women lie about sexual assault, that gets baked into our laws, it gets baked into our culture, and unwittingly, we absorb these influences. I call this the credibility complex. It is a cluster of forces that corrupt, warp our judgments about credibility. And the main drivers of this credibility complex are law and culture. And I talk about both in the book.
I want to ask you about some of the specific myths, but let's step back for a second and say, why? Why is this in the law? Is this because of who made the law? Because of the overall culture in our society? Because women don't have the power? How does this grab hold?
This is about power. Credibility is power in our society, and it's meted out along axes of power. And so if we look around and we notice structural inequalities, we notice power imbalances, we notice oppression, we're likely to see that credibility will fall along those very same dimensions. And so gender is chief among these hierarchies that I talk about in the book, and I put gender front and center, but race matters, disability matters, immigration status matters, LGBTQ status matters. All of these marginalized and more vulnerable populations are least likely to be credited when they come forward, particularly with an allegation of abuse against a powerful man. Because of course, that's where the status quo is most threatened. That's where the risk of destabilizing these structures is most profound. And that's where the credibility discount, as I call it, tends to be most steep.
So I want to get into some of the specific cases, because I think that's one of the amazing things you do in this book. Make it very approachable for everybody, which is why I encourage everybody get this book. And that was me saying it, not Deborah forcing me to say it, but I think we can all learn from it. And so if you take some of the high profile cases, you mentioned Harvey Weinstein. So here's a man of great power, great influence. Women, I think, reluctantly come forward. Are they believed? Why aren't they believed? Is there a package defense to go against them?
I think the first thing to notice is that the credibility complex works in advance to silence victims and survivors. I'm going to use the words interchangeably in this conversation as I do in the book. The credibility complex is so daunting that most abuse never ever gets reported. It never sees the light of day. And you see that in the Weinstein case, his victims stayed quiet for a really long time in many instances. Maybe they disclosed to someone within their trusted inner circle, but some didn't even do that. And that's because they knew what they were up against. They knew that coming forward, the odds were so stacked against them. Harvey Weinstein had all of the power. They had very little compared to him. And the sense was, and I think we can see why, they wouldn't be believed, they would be blamed, and they would be disregarded. And I just want to emphasize that when someone comes forward with an allegation of abuse, I think all three claims are embedded in the allegation. Here are the three claims. It happened, it was wrong, it mattered. And if any of those claims are rejected, the allegation is dismissed. There are different mechanisms for dismissal, but I want people to think about each one of those claims and recognize that it's not enough just to believe that something happened. We also have to put the blame on the right party. We have to allocate fault accurately and fairly, and we have to care.
And do you think the abusers sort of bet on that? Do you think that Harvey Weinstein knew every step of the way? And not just him, what about these enablers? You know, he's surrounded by people who have to see what's going on, including women. What about that phenomenon?
You know, I think it's absolutely true that abusers capitalize on this complex and on the vulnerabilities of people who are least likely to come forward, least likely to be believed, most likely to be blamed, most likely to be treated with indifference. Harvey Weinstein knew very well that he had all of the power in this scenario. And I think that when we see these high profile cases in particular that have been much in the news of late, we see the same harnessing of power to keep victims and survivors silent. And when they do come forward, and this gets back to the question that you asked earlier, Lori, about he said, she said contests, this gets framed in that way. And so he said, she said means she loses because her word doesn't count in the way that his word does.
Right. So you're already setting it up to fail here. But it's not just people like Harvey Weinstein. By the way, I do wonder, you know, he was convicted in New York and they're prosecuting him here in Los Angeles. Many people will ask why. You've already got him convicted. And how would you answer that? Why would it be important?
I think for the victims who are going to take the stand in the LA case, this can be hugely cathartic. It can provide vindication and validation. And I think having that day in court is something that, again, the vast majority of victims will never, ever get. This is something that I think people ought to recognize. Case attrition when it comes to criminal cases involving sexual violence is so enormous. And what I mean by that is that most cases never get reported to the police. Those that do are rarely passed along to prosecutors. And then those that do get to prosecutors may or may not reach a jury and may or may not result in jail time. By some estimates, and this is aggregating government data, out of every 1,000 sexual assaults, 975 perpetrators walk free.
Wow. In your experience, because you were an in-court prosecutor, and I think that's so important in how you write this book, can men prosecutors get across the same thing? Can they relate to the victims? Is this something where it makes a difference how many women actually go into the criminal justice system?
Well, I do think that, in any given profession or discipline, having a good gender balance is really important. In the case of prosecuting special victims' crimes, I think that having someone very sensitive to the challenges and obstacles is hugely important. And as you alluded to earlier, that can come in a woman package, and that can come in a man package.
What do you do with this argument that we see on television? I think that's a great offender in movies, that the women kind of asked for it. They did something. They wanted to get ahead. They were seductive, gone with the wind. How do we deal with that?
So I have a chapter on blame shifting, and I think that this is such an important component of how we dismiss allegations. And sadly, this impulse to blame the victim and not the perpetrator is really, it's sealed into our law in lots of ways. And I'll give you an example. We have a sexual harassment law that asks this question: did she, and I'm going to use the female pronoun here because this is a very gendered phenomenon. Men can be victims of assault and harassment, but the vast majority of victims are women. So I'm going to say she here. Did she demonstrate that the harassment was unwelcome? Okay, the burden is on her to show that. And if she didn't demonstrate that, then the harassment's not actionable. It's not legally actionable. And so what that gets us into in courts of law, is what was she wearing? What kind of banter was she engaged in? What was her sexual history like? These kinds of victim blaming tropes that we see outside the courtroom come into the courtroom as well. And when you throw all of that into the mix, it shouldn't surprise us at all that victim blaming is still a problem, even in 2021.
Yeah, we often hear things like she didn't scream, or, she didn't make her claim right away, or women do this just because they regret having the sex and they make these accusations. In your experience, are those myths or is that true?
So I think this starts with the stranger rape paradigm, which is deeply entrenched in our psyches. It's entrenched in our law, in our culture, and in our individual psychologies. And it's this notion that the rape really is a stranger in an alley, often with some sort of weapon. And even though I think many or most of us know on some level, the level of rationality, that most rape is not that, we still are sort of gravitationally pulled toward that paradigm. And what flows from that are these archetypes of the perfect victim and the monster abuser. And both of those archetypes really cloud our judgments when it comes to credibility. We expect, to your question, we expect victims to fight back like they would a stranger in an alley with a weapon. We expect that they will report immediately. They will have no further contact with that assailant. They will appear the right level of emotional. They won't be too hysterical. They won't be too calm. They'll be just right. They certainly wouldn't have been drinking before this encounter. And they would have been dressed just right. And so if any of those behaviors fall short of this expectation that we have of perfect victims, then the accuser is more likely to be dismissed.
Let's talk about some of these high-profile cases, because I just shake my head. And I'm going to read you a list of names for everybody. And you can jump in with any of them, but Clarence Thomas, Brett Kavanaugh, Donald Trump, Chief Judge Alex Kaczynski, Andrew Cuomo, Chris Cuomo. It strikes me these are all high-profile, highly powerful people. And in each of these cases, women who tried to come forward were often shut down, or at least initially shut down. How is it that people this far up feel like they can get away with it?
There's an array of entitlements that we grant to powerful male elites. And we know about these cases because they make the news, they make the headlines. And don't get me wrong, they should. But I think in the book, what I try to do is view these cases through the lens of the credibility complex and look at the aftermath for the accusers who came forward against these men. And at the same time, to show that ordinary cases that you won't read about on the front pages of the newspaper, also exhibit many of these same patterns. And so I want to find commonalities across these cases without flattening experience, because of course, they're going to be different depending upon who's coming forward.
Right. And I think there's a confusion in society of how sure we have to be even to explore the issue. So let's think about Anita Hill and Justice Kavanaugh, those two cases. Were you surprised that many decades after the Hill-Thomas hearing, that we're going through this again with another Supreme Court justice?
Well, it was difficult. I'll say that. I found it very difficult to watch Dr. Blasey Ford's testimony, which I found completely compelling, convincing. I will say, had I presented a witness at trial, I could have only hoped that witness would have been able to describe what happened as clearly, as cogently as Dr. Ford did. And yet, of course, there was a split in opinion in the country, and we know what happened with Brett Kavanaugh, who's now on the Supreme Court. So in some ways, I think we have moved as a society in the 30 years since Anita Hill testified in front of that same committee against Clarence Thomas. And in other ways, we haven't, and we still have a lot of work to do.
What about former President Trump, who we've got a tape of him, saying, I like to grab them by. How does that just not have that impact on society? How do people kind of let that go?
Well, I think it goes to the entitlement that powerful men feel they have, that can be expressed, and the consequences are slim to none, right? That this accountability that you might think would come from statements or actions tends not to come. And that's part of the credibility complex too. I've already mentioned the credibility discount, but in the book, I talk about what I think is almost more hidden, and that's the credibility boost that we give to men in positions of authority, men with power who are revered, and they get that credibility inflation that really just accentuates the space between accuser and accused when she's vulnerable and when he's powerful.
And you were talking about how the legal system buys into this. The Brock Turner case involved a sexual assault at Stanford. And so much focus was what was going to happen to the defendant, Brock Turner, a promising swimmer. And then there was that powerful moment when the victim herself made a statement. What would you say we should learn from that?
And I highly recommend Chanel Miller's memoir, her account of that. Know My Name, I think, is the name of the book. And she describes really in excruciating detail how she responded to the judge's prioritization of her rapist, her assaulter. It was a sexual assault in that case, and how his pain, the pain that would come from any kind of accountability was so much more important than what she had suffered. And that, I think, is a vivid illustration of the care gap, as I call it, right? This notion that the suffering, the pain of a survivor, a victim of abuse, doesn't matter to us in the same way that we orient to the pain of the powerful. And the pain here is consequences. It's accountability, whatever that looks like.
Can we focus just a little bit, and I know you do in your book, on the media's role? Is the media's role helpful, not helpful, and what can be done about it?
I think the media has, particularly in the past few years, since this Harvey Weinstein story broke, has done a really good job of bringing these cases to the fore. Now, they tend to be certain kinds of cases. They tend to probably skew our understanding of what abuse looks like. And I worry because the kind of corroboration that's needed to report out these cases tends to require multiple accusers. And I understand that, that sort of journalistic standards are going to push the media in the direction of looking for cases where you get the sort of en masse accusations. And yet I do worry about the lone accuser, because sometimes there is just one. And I worry about the first accuser who comes forward without yet knowing that there are others who will come forward in solidarity. And that's still going to be really, really hard. I would like to think that we're changing as a society, as a culture. We're becoming more receptive to these claims and better informed about the realities of abuse. But for now, it's going to be really difficult for that first person to come forward.
What did you think of the recent congressional hearings where the gymnast came forward and said, you didn't listen to us about Dr. Larry Nasser? You really used and kept using us.
It was tragic. It was just tragic and infuriating. And we know that systems fail survivors. And yet hearing just how devastating it was for these victims, I think was eye-opening for many people who watched the hearings. I will tell you, I heard over and over again in the course of years of talking to survivors that the aftermath of abuse can be even worse than the abuse itself. The experience of coming forward only to be disbelieved, blamed, or disregarded is so painful, because it suggests that the community, the people that ought to be protecting victims and seeking accountability for those who hurt them, well, that community is doing just the opposite. It's protecting the abuser. And that, for so many of the women I spoke to, made them feel like they didn't matter.
I'm going to ask in a second about what we can do about it. But the last thing I want to ask about is, you do a wonderful job. Everything you do in here is a wonderful job. But you talk about women being at the bottom of the food chain. And then there are some women who are at the bottom of that. So, we are a Jewish community here in Los Angeles. I take it all communities are affected by this, but some communities might be affected more. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm going to go back to the idea that credibility is power. And so whenever you see more powerless communities or more powerless individuals, you're more likely to see the credibility discount at its largest. And so race matters here. Certainly socioeconomic status matters here. I write in the book a lot about poor women. I write about women of color and Black women especially. And, trans women, LGBTQ women, women who speak English as a second language or whose immigration status is tenuous. All of these vulnerabilities compound the credibility discount.
So I want to grab you for a second and ask about things we can do to make a change, because obviously no one should want to continue along in these directions. And offer you sort of some questions about what's the next step, whether you call it the Me Too movement or just addressing this problem. Are lawsuits effective? Is it education, retooling how the system works? How do we fix this? How do we get out of this mold?
Well, the book looks at law and culture. And I think we've got to make change on both fronts. And I think those changes really have to sort of go in tandem. So I don't think that the law can get too far out in front of culture, but I also don't want it to lag behind. So in the book, I really focus on the places where law bakes in the credibility discount, and those are really easy targets for reform. And I do think we need to make changes to our laws so that they're more fair and that they don't tilt the scales against survivors. And at the same time, I want to be clear, the book is written not for policymakers. It's written for people who are dealing with these questions in their daily lives, who are dealing with disclosures from their family members, their roommates, their coworkers. And people want to do better. They want to be able to respond fairly, and they want to be able to help. And I do think that this is the key to the kind of culture change piece. It's each one of us in our daily lives rewiring ourselves so that we don't start from a place of skepticism, so that we can discard some of these myths that continue to warp our judgments, so that we can get better, more accurate understandings of abuse, so that we can resist the tendencies to blame when these certain scenarios come up, and so that we can really shape the concern that we have for people who may look like us and people who may not look like us. And so we shrink that care gap. These are things that each one of us can do in our daily lives that will help to bring about a more just world.
You talk in the book about restorative justice. Maybe you could mention a little bit more what that is, and is there a value in the survivor being able to confront the abuser? Just that moment. Do you need an apology? What about the human dynamic can change the situation?
Restorative justice is becoming more commonplace on college campuses. We're seeing it sometimes in secondary education settings as well. The idea here is that the offender and the survivor come together, often with other family members and community members, and together start from the proposition that this happened. There's an apology and acceptance of responsibility on the part of the offender. This is a prerequisite for participating in a restorative justice process, is that the offender has to be able to say and be ready to say, I did this and I'm sorry. And then the question becomes, how can the harm be repaired? And that is a conversation that is had between the survivor, the offender, the practitioner who's organizing this conversation and structuring it. And the question of repair and prevention of future harm becomes front and center, because there's been this acknowledgement of harm, this acceptance of responsibility. And for many survivors, this is hugely cathartic. This is validating, this is vindicating. This is exactly what they seek and what they don't get from systems like the criminal justice system or even more formal campus procedures.
And it almost sounds like tshuva in a little bit.
It does. And I write in the book about one case in particular involving a high school girl named Sophia and her encounter with a boy, also a high school boy, who sexually assaulted her. And for Sophia, this process was transformative. It was empowering. And I described sort of how she was changed by it for the good. And I'm also careful to issue a cautionary note, because it's not for everyone. And some survivors don't want it. And some survivors feel dissatisfied with this as a consequence. And so I am not suggesting a one-size-fits-all approach, but I do think that restorative justice needs to be part of this conversation.
Well, I've gotten all the way to this point, and I haven't asked you about the Bill Cosby case, but I am, because that was so much in the news, and then they end up throwing out the conviction. And I'm just wondering what the lasting message will be from a case like that.
It's really mixed. After one trial that ended in a hung jury, he was convicted. And I think that that was, again, a moment of real validation and vindication. The notion that the criminal justice system had finally responded, I think is something that resounded. And victims of Cosby and victims, I think, across the country and even the world heard that message. And then, of course, to have that conviction overturned on what I think is fairly called a technicality. The prosecutor, a long time ago, decided not to prosecute the case. And he decided not to prosecute in large part because he bought into some of these myths that we're talking about. The victim didn't come forward right away. She maintained contact with Cosby. And these facts were seen as really problematic. And so there was a decision and an announcement not to prosecute, and that ended up causing a real problem down the road when, after dozens of women came forward against Cosby and a different prosecutor went forward and convicted him, the high court in the state said it was unfair for him to be told that he wasn't going to be prosecuted, to testify in a civil deposition and have that testimony used against him. That was unfair. Now, I just want to say the remedy that struck me as reasonable would have been to allow him to be tried again without that deposition testimony coming in against him. But the state high court was very concerned with unfairness to Cosby and with what justice required, and went out of its way to say he's already been through a lot. He's been through a civil suit. He's already been through a criminal trial. Let's let this go. I see that as the care gap in action.
You know, the Women's March, there's one this weekend. There are things happening across this nation, whether it be in the Texas law, the Mississippi law. Do you see any of those broader issues tied into some of the concerns that you've addressed in this book?
I do. I think that credibility discounting, once you have a name for it, you see it everywhere. And once you start to see women and marginalized people not being given the authority to speak about their lives, not being recognized as authorities over their own experiences, I think you see it in every realm. This is a sort of a paradigm case. This is sort of quintessential credibility discounting. It's sort of, I think, where we ought to start in thinking about this, but you can certainly move to other contexts. You can move to the medical setting, to the classroom, to your workplace, and your intimate relationships. And you can start to see the ways in which women, and again, other vulnerable populations, just are not credited when they speak, and they're not given the power to make assertions about their lives that then move people to respond in ways that are fair.
Thank you. And thank both of you for such a wonderful, inspiring conversation. There are so many questions that have come through the Q&A. There was a question that came up in relation to the military, for instance, where we have a veteran who is here with us, a female veteran, that mentioned that they have never received any information or education around what to do when someone who's your superior behaves in a way that is improper. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. So there's that perspective of other systems that might need to do some adjustments to the way they handle this. And on the other hand, on the private domain, like, what do we do at home? How do we, educate the next generation to maybe have better tools to deal with these consequences and with those instances as they come up?
These are such important questions. I'll address the military setting first. I do have several cases involving the military in the book, and I think it's a prime setting for what psychologists refer to as institutional betrayal. The idea here is that we rely on our institutions to do right by us when we're harmed. We identify as members of a community, and when the institution fails us, that is extremely harmful. And there's a lot of research that suggests that in the military in particular, survivors are mistreated. And it may well be in part because there isn't this education about how to report. but I think it reflects a larger problem that the institution is not yet responding effectively, and in fact is dismissing many survivors who do come forward, who do report up the chain. There's a lot of work being done in Congress about getting that reporting system out of the chain of command, which I think would be a good start to have a more rational system that didn't ask individuals to report often to people who were responsible or complicit in the abuse. And then more broadly, the kinds of conversations that we ought to be having with our children. I think that those are essential. I think that if we do want to move to the next phase of our evolution as a society in how we respond to this problem, which is clearly pressing. I mean, in the last few years, I think there can be no question that this is prevalent. This kind of abuse happens all the time. I'm sad to say that it is unusual for me to talk about this topic with a woman who doesn't tell me her story of harassment or assault.
Yes,
and so
of course.
this problem is everywhere around us. And in order to really make some inroads, we have to keep talking about it.
With that very important, clear message, I want to thank both of you, Professor Lori Levinson and Professor Deborah Tuerkheimer. Please get your hands on a copy of the book, and thank you for joining us today for this important conversation.